Hello and welcome to this fifth lesson in the remote lesson sociology series, this one focusing on the theories of crime and deviance and how we put all of these theories together. So what you've looked at so far are the different theories largely in isolation. This is going to show us how we put those theories together, how we evaluate them, how we start to think about how we might use them to answer an essay question. You're going to need the lesson notes template that you should have been sent. If you don't have it, you will find that there is a link to it in the description of this video at the bottom there. So get that, settle in, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start by doing a bit of a recap of the different theories. You should see up here there is some prompts to get you to think about what the key theories that we've looked at so far have said. You will also find in your notes, lesson notes booklet, there is a more in-depth summary of what each of the theories suggest. So functionalism, remember, starts from Durkheim's work, from the idea that what crime does is it serves a function for society. So it helps to show people what's right and wrong, so a bit of boundary maintenance. It helps to develop a sense of collective conscience. People get a collective sense of what people can and can't do. Functionalism argues that crime and deviance reinforces social norms and values, and that actually you need a little bit of crime in society. Otherwise, we have a sense of anomie, which is lawlessness, and if we have a sense of anomie, which is lawlessness, then society breaks down. Yes, there are periods in society when there is more crime and more deviance, which leads to societal change, and that can be beneficial, Durkheim argues. And then we looked at the work of Merton and strain theory and the idea that people want to get to the American dream, want to develop a sense of success, but then there's a strain sometimes between their ability to do that and the reality of their situation. This leads to a certain type of anomie, which can lead some people to engage in criminal or deviant behavior. And the problem with functionalism is that it ignores the victim because it assumes that it's okay. People, never mind the person that was the victim of crime, it served a purpose for the rest of society and provided a function. It also doesn't, but Durkheim doesn't really tell us what is the right amount of crime and not. And also, okay, Merton talks about the strain theory, but that's only acquisitive crime. That's only crimes where you're trying to get some material benefit. If we all have these shared norms and values, we don't really know why some people decide to commit crime then, because we have these shared norms and values. We know that what's right and what's wrong, so why do some people choose to commit crime and some people not? Okay, so what you need to do, have a look at the notes page that's on functionalism in your lesson notes booklet. Go back to the notes that you already have, fill in some extra bits, make sure you've got a comprehensive understanding of what functionalism theory says about crime and deviance, and you've got some evaluation there as well. Okay, welcome back. Although we looked at them separately when we studied them, I've put Marxism and Neo Marxism together here, and you'll understand why later on in this lesson. Obviously, classic Marxism talks about criminogenic capitalism. The fact that capitalism exists means that there will be crime because of the inequalities at the very heart of the capitalist structure in society. It talks about the ideological function of the law and of crime and deviance. It talks about a false consciousness that workers feel as though health and safety laws are there to protect them, but actually they are just there to make sure that the economy grows and make sure that the capitalist elite continue to make money. If we think about the current time of me recording this lesson, the government's just announced that people should go back to work during this COVID-19 pandemic, and they have put in place with employers certain laws to try and keep employees safe. Now, from a Marxist perspective, those laws are to keep employees safe, or are they just to get people back to work so we can get the economy moving again? Classic Marxist theory believes that the real criminals are the elite, and that white collar crime is not detected, or white collar crime is not punished in the same way that working class crime is, although it does actually ignore white collar crime, and doesn't particularly explain why white collar crime happens. If everything's about fighting back against the capitalist system and everything's about inequality, why is it that some people who have quite a lot of money already are involved in tax evasion, fraud, etc.? That's something that Marxists don't get to grip with. Neo-Marxists build on the idea that the capitalist structure is the thing which is the main cause of crime. However, they look at it from a voluntaristic view rather than a deterministic view. They look at some acts that people commit being proto-political. So if you remember, when we looked at neo-Marxism, the work of Pearson, who talked about the way in which racial abuse and racial assaults on Pakistani youths in some northwest communities, that was more than just some sort of racist attack. It was part of a proto-political class consciousness struggle against the idea that a lot of working class jobs had been taken by immigrant communities. And what neo-Marxism talked about, if you remember, was a fully social theory of deviance. So this idea that we've got to look at the wider context of crime, from looking at how the capitalist structure creates an environment in which that crime takes place, but also thinking about labeling theory and the way in which the media, the criminal justice system, police, etc., label certain communities. If you remember Hall's Policing the Crisis, neo-Marxist study, who said that the crisis around black mugging and the crime of black mugging was not actually really to do with that crime. It was to do with a crisis of capitalism, a problem in the economy, and that's why the finger was pointed at these black people who were involved in street crime. There was actually very little real increase in street crime. So you've got to understand, for neo-Marxism, the connection of capitalism and labeling theory working together in that theory. So again, look at your lesson notes template. There's a sketch outline of some key ideas about Marxism and neo-Marxism there already. Go back to your own notes that you should already have and see if you can add some depth to the thing that's already there. And we will pause this whilst you have a go at that. Okay, so we move on now to subcultural theories. And I emphasize the plural there because although subcultural theory starts from the idea that there are some groups in society who do not share the same norms and values as the majority, and it's these different values that help to explain criminal and deviant actions. The theories have many different ideas about why subcultural groups form. So you take someone like Albert Cohn, for example. He talks about status frustration and the fact that many working class boys feel as though they can't get the same status as their middle class peers, and so therefore they develop subcultures. Think about Miller talks about focal concerns, so that many subcultural groups have different focal concerns, different values like toughness and smartness. Someone like Katz talks about edge work and about subcultures being groups of people who engage in edgy, deviant behavior for a laugh, for a risk, for the banter. You've got Cloward and Olin, who talk about illegitimate opportunity structures. So that in some communities, the legitimate opportunity structures are closed off, and so illegitimate opportunity structures are followed in order for people to try and succeed. So there are different types of subcultural theories and different ideas about why these subcultural theories form, but they all, to some degree, argue that some of the people in these subcultural groups, and it's usually working class males, they invert middle class values. They invent their values what is successful, and they invert that so that their values of what is successful are opposite or different from the mainstream values. So if you think about a school context where you might have looked at subcultures in the context of the education module in school, then the general mainstream behavior is to do what your teacher says and do your homework and listen and be compliant. If you think about people who might have been disillusioned with school, they might develop a subculture which is to do the opposite. So they don't listen, they don't behave respectfully, they interrupt, they don't do their work, etc. And someone like Nightingale talks about the paradox of exclusion, so that a lot of these subcultural groups, and he's thinking about sort of gangs in parts of America, their status, they show their status by some purchase of some mainstream material goods. So they have like nice trainers, or they have lots of bling, or they have the latest technology. So they are buying into the mainstream status. However, they feel excluded from society, and so maybe they engage in criminal activity, gang related activity, in order to get these status symbols. So all of the subcultural theories start from the idea that people who are involved in criminal deviant behavior often have different values from the mainstream. Now, someone like Matza, for example, who talks about delinquency and drift, says, I don't really buy into subcultural theory, because actually lots of people are just doing some sort of deviant act or engaging in some sort of deviance, which is just a one-off thing, or it's just part of general juvenile delinquency. It's part of a general sort of growing up. It's little things that people do when they're on a night out or when they're on holiday, and they just kind of use techniques of neutralization, he calls it, to say, well, I was just having a laugh, or I was just joking around. And it's not like they've created or joined a subculture. They're just engaging in what he calls some subterranean values, some deviant behavior, as a kind of one-off thing, as part of being a general sort of mainstream normal human being, that people do daft things. And so that is a criticism of subcultural theory, that matters kind of like, well, are these people really in the subculture, or are they just growing up? But a big criticism of subcultural theory, which is linked to that, is that a lot of subcultural theories focus on working class males. And so it's not really explaining crime in a wider context. It's not really a theory of crime that covers all different types of crime. It's just looking at working class males. All right. Okay. So again, using the recap, the sort of general information on the lesson notes template on subcultural theory to get you started, you now want to do a little bit more detail. You can look back at the notes that you've made already. Make sure you've got a page of a summary of notes on subcultural theory, so you've got a good understanding of the key ideas of some of the sociologists, and also of some criticisms and some evaluation. Okay, so now we turn to look at labeling theory. And this is different from the other theories that you've looked at so far. And it's different because of the fact that it doesn't really try and answer the question, why do people commit crime? That's what functionalism, Marxism, Neo Marxism, subcultural theory has been trying to do. It's been trying to answer that question, why do people commit crime? Labeling theory isn't trying to answer that question. Labeling theory is saying, why are people labeled? And also, what is the consequence of that label? And therefore they see crime as being socially constructed. So people commit acts, some of which are deemed by society to be criminal or deviant, and some of which are deemed not. Therefore, society has constructed what is criminal and what is deviant. If we legalized the sale, distribution, use of cannabis, then all of the people that were being prosecuted for using cannabis, selling cannabis, growing cannabis would no longer be classed as criminal or deviant, and so therefore we would have reduced the crime figure. So by deciding that something is criminal or deviant, we are constructing that crime and that deviance. So the theorists who support labeling theory, people like Lemire, people like Cicero, talk about primary and secondary deviance. So primary deviance, something that somebody does, but it doesn't really get noticed, doesn't get labelled by anybody else. You might just have done a bit of speeding, you might have dodged a fare on a metro, nobody found out. Secondary deviance is where you do something and it is labelled as deviant, and other people in society label you. And some theorists argue that this leads to a master status. So this person becomes, their status is, he's the thief, she's the paedophile, he's the murderer, and this becomes their status. So labeling theory starts from a very different premise of the other theories that we've looked at so far. And labeling theory also argues that actually what can therefore happen is that deviance can be amplified. We can label people in a certain way, and then they start to respond and behave in that way, and then that actually amplifies the deviance. We make more of an issue of something than it was in the first place, and this can lead to moral panics, and it can lead to people getting worried in society about an issue that isn't really actually an issue. And that was what Stuart Hall was talking about when he studied black muggers in his Policing the Crisis study. We'll do more about moral panics and deviance amplification later in this course. Okay. Obviously, a criticism of labeling theory is that it doesn't try to answer that question. It doesn't really get to grips with who's labelled more than others. It just kind of looks at people are labelled. It doesn't also really get to grips with why some people reject their label and don't respond in the same way as other people. So again, there is an element of only providing part of an explanation. So again, pause. Look at the notes that are already there for you in the lesson note template. Look back at your own notes that you did a couple of lessons ago. Make sure you've got a solid little set of notes on key ideas, key theories, and some evaluation of labeling theory. Okay, so now write realist theory. Now remember, what separates realist theory from the other theories that we've looked at so far is that realist theory looks at crime as a real issue, not something that's abstract. A lot of the criticism of the other theories that we've looked at is that they don't really focus on the victim or take crime as a serious issue. They just look at it as an abstract thing to look at in an intellectual way, rather than thinking about what's the impact on communities of crime and deviance. And so realist theory, their ideas are based on looking at the causes of crime and then what they can do to tackle that. So right realist theory, we know, believes that people make a rational choice. That's what Ron Clark says, to commit crime. They also believe that there are biological differences. That's what Murray talks about, and that there are problems of socialization, and that's why people commit crime. That society, the nanny state, allows people to be in single parent households, gives them benefits, gives them too much help. This creates a perverse incentive for people's families to break down, and people can live on their own and live off the state. That breakdown of the traditional family, which is something that New Right theory talks about in relation to the family, is bad for society, and it leads to broken communities, and that leads to crime and deviance. And so the way of dealing with that from a New Right perspective is to clamp down on any sort of minor disorder. The footage that you can see behind me is stuff that you've seen before of New York subways in the 1980s. And the idea of zero tolerance policing. So you clamp down on any sort of antisocial behaviour, any sort of graffiti, anything that might bring disorder, which means that later on you hope that means it's not going to lead to more serious crime. If you clamp down on the little things, and the big things won't happen. This is based on Wilson's idea of broken windows, that very influential in New Right theory, that you should have a zero tolerance policing, that you should clamp down on things, and this is a way that you will stop crime. So you don't allow communities to tip over into lawlessness because you clamp down at the first sign of some sort of antisocial behaviour or some sort of deviant behaviour. So, again, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to pause. You need to think about some evaluation as well. Remember we said that this kind of ignores the structural causes of crime. It's not really a rational choice for everybody, because structural inequality in society suggests that a lot of people actually don't have a choice. That it's the structural inequality that causes them to commit crime, and this kind of ignores the inequality in society. That's one point of evaluation we can make about right realist theory. So, pause me, look at the notes that are already there in your lesson note booklet, look at what you've already done, put those together, get yourself a nice little set of notes on new right theory causes, how they tackle the problem, and how they seek to deal with the problems of crime, and then some evaluation of that. Okay, and this now brings us to left realist theory. So a response from the political left to the new right ideas of the 1980s. New left theory tries to think about the structural causes of crime rather than just punishment and zero tolerance. It does, as the slogan that Tony Blair used suggests, want to be tough on crime. So they do adopt some harsh measures in terms of trying to clamp down on antisocial behaviour, but they also want to be tough on the causes of crime. So what is it that's structurally wrong with society that causes crime? So here we're thinking about marginalisation, relative deprivation, subcultures, the way people feel shut out from the rest of society. And because those people feel shut out from the rest of society, New Left theory argues, what we need to do to tackle crime is not just be tough on people who commit crime, but what we need to do is to actually try and be tough on those causes of crime. So how do we improve social community projects? How do we try and invest money in a better education, youth clubs, activities for young people, etc., so that therefore those causes of crime, the things that maybe make people feel shut out of society, that make people feel separated and marginalised and deprived, aren't there, and so therefore they don't commit as much crime in the first place. And we looked at the Perry Preschool project, Perry Preschool from the High School project, and we looked at the way in which they invested in early years education, and that had an impact in some socioeconomically deprived communities in America and led to less offending in the future. So, for the final time, you're going to need to look at the theories notes that are already there, have a look at the ones that you gathered in the lesson that we did on New Left theory, and then put them together so you've got a nice little set of notes where you've got a clear idea of the key theories, key sociologists, and some criticisms. And you're looking at the causes and how they tackle crime, and then some of the problems with that. Okay, off you go. Okay, I don't expect you to do all of this next thing that I'm going to talk about now, but you can see this table here. And what you need going forward is, and we started doing this on A3 paper, might be an idea to use a big piece of paper so that you've got all your ideas in one place. What you really need is a table a bit like this for each of the theories. So you need to be clear on the key theories, and you need to be clear on the key ideas, and you need to be clear on sociologists you can use to support those ideas and to exemplify them. And you need to be clear about the internal criticisms. Remember, what we mean by that is specific criticisms that are made. So a specific criticism of Durkheim or Merton or Albert Cohen, for example. So Albert Cohen talks about status frustration, and he talks about the way in which working class boys have inverted middle class values. Well, a specific criticism of that is that seems like quite a sophisticated thing for working class boys or anybody to do, to sit down and think, how can I invert middle class values? So that's a specific criticism of Merton. External criticisms are the wider evaluation and wider criticism from other theories. So, for example, Marxism obviously criticizes functionalism because functionalism sees society as based on consensus, whereas Marxism sees it as based on conflict. Labeling theory would criticize most of the other structural theories for being too focused on what causes crime and too focused on looking at things in terms of official statistics and trying to work out why people commit crime, whereas labeling theory is going to say all those statistics are socially constructed, all crime is socially constructed, we should just look at the labeling process. By the same token, structural theories are going to look back at labeling theory and say, come on, labeling theory, you can't just cop out and not answer the question, why do people commit crime? You've got to tie your labeling theory to something more of a structural approach so we can understand why there is crime in society. New Left are going to criticise New Right for their way of approaching crime, too much focus on punishment and control from the New Right. New Left are going to say, whereas New Right are going to say about New Left that they are too soft on offenders. There's too much time and money spent on trying to deal with community projects, and that's just more of the nanny state throwing money at the problem instead of us having a zero tolerance policing and clamping down on crime that way. So internal criticism is specific criticism of that particular theory or that particular theorist, that particular sociologist. An external criticism, a criticism from one of the other theories. And when you're writing answers, as we're going to start to have a look at in a moment, you need a blend of both. Okay, so if you can develop over the next few weeks this A3 template, or however you want to design it for each of the theories, but has these three strands, what are the key ideas and theorists and the key sociologists in there, what can we say that's an internal criticism of those sociologists, and then what can we say about how the other theories might criticize them. If you can have that for each of the theories, then it will make answering essay questions based on the theories of crime and deviance fairly simple to do. And it's looking at essay questions and how we answer them that we are going to move on to now. Okay, so here we have a classic 30-mark essay question from the Crime and Deviance paper. Essentially, it's the same sort of skill as the 20-mark essay question, and in fact the only difference in the fact that it's worth 10 more marks, because the mark scheme actually looks exactly the same, is that you're expected to write with a bit more depth and a bit more sophistication. So we can see classic format, you've got an item, apply material from item B and your own knowledge, evaluate the usefulness of functionalist approaches in understanding crime and deviance. It says in the item, some functionalist sociologists argue that crime and deviance are caused by the inability of some people to gain the rewards of society, for example, because of educational underachievement. So we could have Merton's strain theory here. Those members of society whose opportunities are blocked cannot achieve the goals of society by socially approved means. Okay, so again, a bit of Merton there in terms of the strain theory. It says evaluate the usefulness of functionalist approaches, plural. So the suggestion is that we need to look at not just Merton, but other functionalist approaches as well. And there is an expectation that in evaluating the usefulness, you're going to weigh up the benefits of functionalist theory alongside other theories. Okay, so let's first of all have a look at some example answers. Okay, well, you have a copy of this in your lesson notes template. This is the second answer. This is student response B. It'll become clear why we're doing B before A as we go through. So we are looking here at the structure of their answer, and we're looking to see what they do, which is good and what is not so good. So we've got functionalist approach. Their explanation of crime as similar. Crime for them is seen as functional because it allows individuals to learn right from wrong. Crime is inevitable and normal because it happens everywhere. So a fairly simple statement of what functionalist approach says. We have something about Durkheim there. We have a little bit towards the end of the paragraph which says, however, Durkheim believes crime benefits everyone but fails to see how it may affect the individual. Therefore, this theory is not useful because it's based on a meta-narrative. So there's a little bit of what we remember we said about your three strands of your analysis of each theory. There's a little bit of what we call internal criticism at the end of that first paragraph there by criticizing Durkheim particularly. It then says Durkheim also recognises that in modern society, individuals become increasingly different from one another. One could argue that he doesn't mention at what point society is dysfunctional and how it can be measured. So again, a little bit of specific criticism of Durkheim there. Doesn't really tell us what a level of crime is good, how much crime is bad, when does crime become dysfunctional as opposed to good. So some specific criticisms there of Durkheim. We've then got a bit of a problem because the third main paragraph talks about Cohen as a functionalist and talks about the American dream. We've got a little bit of a mix-up here because Cohen, as we know, is a subcultural theorist. He's talking about status frustration. He's not, strictly speaking, a functional theorist. However, the paragraph at the top of the right-hand column then starts talking about Merton, who we know is a functionalist theorist, and there's an explanation of what Merton states. And then we have Cloward and Olin, who it says agree with Merton that legitimate opportunities are important, although they identified three types of subcultures. So there's a tiny little bit here where we are talking about subcultural theory as maybe different from functionalist theory, but that isn't particularly explicit, it's more implicit. And then at the end, overall functionalist theory lacks finding all the patterns in crime by ignoring gender and ethnicity, functionalism, meta-narratives. So there's some specific criticism of functionalism. So if you think about our three strands that I've encouraged you to learn for each theory, key theories in sociology, key ideas, internal criticisms, external criticisms. What we've got here is probably some good stuff from the first column. So we've got some good stuff in terms of specific sociologists, Durkheim and Merton. We've got a bit of a mistake with Cohen and Cloward and Olin. But we could say that you're using Cloward and Olin as an external criticism, even though that isn't made particularly explicit. And we've got a little bit of internal criticism when we look at specific problems with Durkheim's work. Let's have a look at what the examiner says. The answer gets 19 to 24 range, so it gets 20 out of 30, so it's 2/3 of the marks. There's a wider range of material covered which is mostly accurate, although a little confused on Cohen, so we've said Albert Cohen's not really a functionalist theorist. A wider range of concepts are included, but not always fully developed. Throughout the answer, there's an attempt to evaluate, but it's a bit general, it lacks a bit of sophistication. There is a lack of discussion of other perspectives, so there's a brief mention of postmodernization, there's a brief mention of Cloward Nolan and illegitimate opportunity structures and subculture, but that is not done explicitly. There are attempts to apply material to the question by considering the usefulness of each study. So there's a decent amount from if you think about those three columns again, decent amount from key theories, ideas, sociologists. There's some from internal criticisms. It's really quite badly lacking in external criticism, which is why it only gets 20 out of 30. I say only 20 out of 30 would be comfortably above a C if we talked about getting 2/3 of the marks throughout the whole of the exam. So if you were getting 66% or so of the marks throughout the whole exam, you are going to be comfortably above a C grade at A level. Okay, let's now look at student response A, which in your lesson notes template comes before B, as it tends to be the way with A before B. But you'll understand why we've chosen to do this one second, because it's a better answer. So first it starts with the item suggests some functionalist sociologists such as Merton argue that crime and deviance occurs when individuals are unable to achieve the goals of society. So we're straight in there with Merton, straight in there with a bit of strain theory taken from the item. However, there are other functionalist approaches to crime and deviance, such as that proposed by Hershey, which may be seen as a more useful approach. Hershey talks about control theory. He's a functionalist theorist. We haven't studied him directly, that doesn't matter. You've studied other functionalist theorists that aren't mentioned in here, okay? So then we've got Durkheim, he presents the traditional functionalist view. So we've already got a richer sense of an understanding of functionalist theory. Application of Durkheim's theory to a contemporary example, such as that of April Jones's case, demonstrates that the traditional functionalist view is useful and it's applicable to society today. The answer goes on to talk about the three functions that Durkheim talks about, and then we have in the middle of the second paragraph, however, one criticism of Durkheim is the occurrence of crime is likely to seem positive to the victim. For example, it would be difficult for the family of April Jones to view that disappearance as positive because it caused social integration in the local community. Thus, the theory could be seen as lacking in usefulness because it's not applicable to all members of society. So again, this idea that functionalism, like many theories, looks at crime in the abstract and therefore doesn't look at victims. Now, there would be a chance there to maybe put a bit of new left or new right realism in. New right who look at the society in a similar way to functionalists and say, look, one of the things that new right says is that we should think about the victims and we should think about crime as a real thing because of the fact that we need to, and they could talk about how they tackle crime there. We move on to talk about Merton's strain theory and the American dream. Then there's a specific criticism of Merton. Then another important area of functionalism is subcultural theory. So they're making a link between functionalism and subcultural theory. Subcultural theory does come out of functionalist theory, even though it's a distinct theory in itself. One way in which this area of functionalism is useful is because it explains both utilitarian and non-utilitarian crime. So they're saying, look, there's a connection between Merton and Cohen, and they're doing this in a better way than the previous answer that kind of assumed that subcultural theory or that Cohen was actually a functionalist when really he's a subcultural theorist. And then we've got a bit of criticism of Cohen, and then here we go, third paragraph from the end. Marxists may support Cohen's theory because acknowledge that the working class are denied opportunities due to capitalism. We've got a little bit of Marxism there. We've got a bit of an external criticism coming in of functionalism, which is something that we didn't see in the first answer. One positivist critique of this theory is that Sampson and Lamb provided empirical data. We've got a little bit of a methodological evaluation there. Now, you can't quite do that yet because you haven't done as much theory and methods material in depth at this point in the course, but that's something you could add in later. What we can see, though, quite clearly is some elements of the answer that are better. Okay, there's a couple of extra sociologists mentioned, and they're identified correctly, but really, Durkheim, Merton, Cohen, the other answer mentioned Cloward, Nolan, the actual stuff, if you like, the sociology, the key ideas, theories, although they were slightly misidentified in the previous answer, there's a similar amount of stuff. Where this answer is better, undoubtedly, is it has more internal criticisms, so more things from that middle column of your three columns on each theory, and there is definitely some external criticism there, so things from different theories that would criticize functionalism that wasn't there in the first answer. Right, let's see what the examiner says about this one. Well, we can see already it's nearly full marks. Now, let that show you, yes, this person's supposed to have written this in 35-40 minutes in an exam, but this is by no means a perfect answer, and it's up to 28 marks out of 30. That's pretty good. It's got a sound, conceptually detailed knowledge of relevant material, number of relevant points, so that's all the stuff from the first column. There's plenty of sociology in there about functionalists, there's plenty of theories, ideas. These include the use of examples to illustrate the perspective, so there are some real life examples that illustrate the perspective. You don't need them, but they work quite nicely here. An evaluation is demonstrated throughout through comparison of the functionalist approaches, so it kind of says Durkheim's good at this, but he's not so good at that, and Merton's better at this, and what about this? And by the use of Marxist perspectives. Appropriate conclusions are made, although the overall conclusion of the essay is more limited. It seems like they kind of ran out of time and just tagged something on at the end. So, what is it that the answer needs? The answer needs to genuinely evaluate the usefulness of the theory. It needs to do that by looking at some elements of the theory in depth. So think about those three columns for your notes going forward. Key ideas and theorists, sociologists. It needs some specific internal criticism, that's the middle column, and it needs some external criticism, some evaluation from other theories, which is your third column. Now you must have guessed what is coming. Yes, that's right, sociology fans, it's time for you to have a go. So here we have similar item A this time. Marxist sociologists explain capitalist society by focusing on social class and class divisions. For Marxists, therefore, crime can be seen as a reaction against an unequal society. Crime is not the fault of the individual, but is linked to their social position and the unequal distribution of wealth in society. This means the working class is more likely to need to commit crime. The police are also more likely to target areas where the working class live. On the other hand, white-collar and other middle-class crimes often go unnoticed or punished. Applying material from item A and your own knowledge, evaluate the usefulness of Marxist approaches to our understanding of crime and deviance. So, once again, note the word approaches, plural. Okay, so it's not just Marxist standard theory, it's Marxist approaches, plural. Now, what this means for you is that you can have a bit of traditional Marxism and a bit of Neo Marxism in. So, if you think about traditional Marxism, you could talk about Chambliss and you could talk about Althusser, who are in your notes. For Neo Marxism, you might talk about Hall, you might talk about Pearson, you might talk about Young et al. But you have got many examples that you could use to highlight what traditional Marxists and what neo-Marxists say. So that is your column, left-hand column, the key ideas, the key theories. Now, for internal criticisms, this is quite easy to do because traditional Marxism has many criticisms of it. It's too deterministic, it's a meta-narrative, and it ignores the victim, it romanticizes crime, etc. And because neo-Marxism grew out of Marxism, then it enables you to talk about neo-Marxist views where they see crime as more voluntaristic, they see people as having a choice, and they see it as a more sophisticated way of looking at the impact of capitalism on society, and they incorporate labeling as well. So in that first bubble there in your answer, there's a good opportunity for you to be able to do quite a bit of analysis of Marxist theory by comparing traditional Marxism and neo-Marxism and evaluating it by looking at labeling theory, and that would allow you to touch on both the first, second, and third column. I keep going back to that model of thinking about the theories like that for each theory. Now, in the little bubble on the right-hand side, you could see there are some opportunities to do some external criticism. Now, you wouldn't have to use all of them, obviously, because if you think about the answer that got 28 out of 30, it only used Marxism as an external theory and a little bit of subcultural theory to evaluate functionalism. So, you could say, criticize Marxism from a functionalist perspective, because you could talk about functionalism saying that society is based on consensus and it's collective conscience and social solidarity, and it's not all about divisions and divisiveness and inequality. Or you could look at it from a new right perspective, and you could say, well, new right would argue actually that it's not class that causes crime. It's more to do with poor socialization. It's more to do with biological issues. That's what causes crime, and crime needs to be tackled with a zero tolerance policy on these communities who are causing this crime. You could look at it from a new left perspective, because we know that new left, it sympathizes with some of the Marxist ideas, but it sees it as too simplistic. It sees it as romanticizing crime. It sees it as ignoring the victim. So I would suggest you've got a good model here for answering this question by starting off looking at traditional Marxism, look at that in some depth and criticize it with some internal criticisms, then do a comparison with neo-Marxism and say how neo-Marxism is different, and get a bit of a comparison going and bring in a bit of label and theory, which is what neo-Marxism uses to explain how the capitalist system helps to create crime in a more sophisticated way. And then you could pick one or more of the other theories and say, look, hang on a minute, Marxism suggests this, but what about looking at it from the perspective of these other theories, or one of these other theories? And then you want to reach some sort of judgment about how useful Marxism is. And Marxist theories do draw our attention to the inequalities in society. However, they have some failings in the way that they maybe romanticize crime and the way that they don't really offer proper solutions for dealing with the problem of crime. We can't just say, let's overthrow the system and have communism. That's not really a realistic way of dealing with crime in society. So, you've got a good idea of how you would plan that out. You've hopefully got some good notes that you've developed over the course of your last few lessons and in this lesson. And you've got the opportunity to flesh those notes out further with those sort of 3-column summary notes that allow you to evaluate in a little bit more depth. So you're going to write this answer. If you have any problems, let me know. But you've got 2 good models and a good plan to help you have a go at answering this question on Marxist approaches to crime and deviance. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the lesson. Have a go at that essay. If you have any problems, let me know. Work on those A3 or however you want to design them with the 3 strands for each of the theories so that you've got a really good handle on the theories before we move on and look at something else in the course, okay? I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's been useful. If you have any problems, let me know. Until next time. See you later. Goodbye.